Hi, I'm Richard Weiss, former president of the Explorers Club, and I'd like to welcome you to the Explorers Club 50 lecture series. If you're new to the club and to the lecture series, I'd like to welcome you and tell you a little about ourselves and also about the Explorers Club 50. First of all, the Explorers Club was established in 1904. At that time, by a bunch of guys trying to get to the North and South Pole. And since that time, our members have covered just about every corner of the earth. In fact, when you walk into the lobby of our historic headquarters on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, there is a plaque on the wall that perhaps summarizes it best. Our members have been the first to step foot on the North Pole, first on the South Pole, first to stand upon Mount Everest, the highest point, the first to go to the lowest point in the ocean, and also our members were the first to go to the moon. Other notable explorers have been Theodore Roosevelt and Jane Goodall, and just about every notable explorer of the 21st century. Now about the Explorers Club 50. The slogan is 50 people who are changing the world that the world needs to know about. And I'll give you a little genesis of how that started. Last spring, during the beginning of the pandemic, one of our members said to me, "You've got to check out this performance or this video called Earthrise by a young poet named Amanda Gorman." I watched it, and it was about the Apollo 8 mission, which were our members. And I was blown away by how she described Earth, the environment, and the fragility of our planet. We started a short correspondence and became pen pals. She became a member. But I also thought, how many other Amanda Gormans are out there in the world? In fact, when I got together with the chair of this program, Joe Rohde, who you'll be meeting in just a few minutes, we got together and we said, how do we want to describe exploration in the future? And if we're truly a global exploration society, then our club has to represent the world as we see it. And not just in terms of how people look, but also how people describe the earth and the sky and just about everything in science. So, how did we choose the EC50 honorees? 50 people who are changing the world that the world needs to know about. The first thing Joe Rohde said to me was that if you take a problem and you approach it with the same people, you are always going to get the same type of result. So he immediately said, we wanted as diverse a judging panel, people who could look at the world through a different narrative and lens and be able to come together with some sort of conclusion. So he put together a group that was from all over the world. The next thing we had to do is have our membership give us people that they have met along the way that were doing incredible things that maybe weren't recognized for their work. We got about 450 nominations, and I have to tell you, they were pretty amazing. We could have gotten an EC 200 out of it. We came out with our top 50 honorees, and the result was nothing less than spectacular. We have people covering all sectors of disciplines from space to paleontology, oceanography. We have Inuit, Native Americans, Sri Lankans, Indians, Africans, and just across the border. So this is the inaugural lecture series, and we'll have a few more that'll be rolling out over the week. But in the meantime, I want you to sit back and enjoy some good old-fashioned storytelling.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the EC50 Conversations. This time, our theme is activists, and we have three very interesting people to have a conversation with, Justin Dunnavant, Danielle Lee, and Joshua Powell. They work in different parts of the world doing very, very different things. Let's just see what they have to say about their work themselves, and we'll be right back for the conversation.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Justin Dunnavant. I am an archaeologist. I am a professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, and I am co-founder and currently the chairman of the board of the Society of Black Archaeologists. I'm also an instructor with an organization called Diving with a Purpose, and I work very closely with the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, particularly the Slave Wrecks Project. Over the last, I'd say about 5 years, I've been conducting archaeology both on land and more recently underwater related to Africa and the African diaspora. My research really focuses in on the island of St. Croix, known as partly as the U.S. Virgin Islands. And it's there that me and my colleagues, Dr. Ayanna Flewellen, a fellow Explorer member, and our other colleagues from other universities around the country are engaging in a multi-year archaeological study, trying to explore the experiences of enslaved Africans on an 18th century Danish plantation. The research has been very enlightening and insightful. For one, it's shown us that a lot of the infrastructure that these plantations were built on was actually built on top of indigenous infrastructure. Additionally, it's given us a new way to look at the experiences of enslaved people. My own research for this area looks at the environmental impacts of the transatlantic slave trade. From that, we're studying everything from coral degradation to shoreline erosion to contaminants in the soil, as well as the leading indications of runoff that come from plantation agriculture and that continue and persist today. Working in the Caribbean, especially during these times, we're also grappling with issues of climate change and trying to more clearly understand those and their colonial origins as well. Beyond just the archaeological project itself, we also conduct a training program for university students. We take students from historically black colleges and universities and bring them down to the U.S. Virgin Islands with us for 6 weeks to conduct archaeological work. From that work, some of them go on to do further archaeology research, and then some of them are actually studying in universities and major institutions in the United States right now. We also work very closely with a number of other organizations, including the Cultural Heritage and Nature Tourism Group in St. Croix, the Virgin Islands Caribbean Cultural Center at the University of the Virgin Islands, a group called Junior Scientists in the Sea, as well as another organization called Archaeology in the Community. And then we also work very closely with the Caribbean Center for Boys and Girls. Our colleagues with Junior Scientists in the Sea have actually been instrumental in training some of the young people on the island in scuba diving, and our colleagues with Archaeology in the Community have been instrumental in actually getting those same students archaeological training and exposure. From the archaeological training and exposure those kids get, they get a better understanding of the cultural environments in which they live in, and they get to experience what archaeology could possibly be for a potential career path, or maybe they're interested in related fields such as the National Park Service, or potentially scuba diving training and scuba tourism as well. So we try to offer a unique opportunity to provide opportunities not just for college students, but for local students on the island as well. And we're trying to use this more than just an archaeological experience, but really trying to create a new model for the way in which archaeology is done. Usually when we conduct archaeology in spaces, we're often engaging in projects for our own specific research questions, and the ideas of training often get put to the side. But we really developed this program with the idea of training in mind. The goal is that one day, we won't be needed, and that there'll be enough capacity locally on the island to continue to conserve cultural heritage sites, and perhaps even help other islands and other communities with conserving their cultural heritage as well. Our work doesn't only happen on land, though. We also engage heavily in underwater research and archaeology, particularly with this interest in studying the environmental impacts of the slave trade. I felt that it wasn't enough just to do the archaeological research, but then to actually offer some sort of redress or mitigation towards this process. And therefore, I started doing coral restoration work alongside my partners with Diving with a Purpose and my other colleagues who are scuba certified. So we're trying to set up a joint tandem program where we actually take the students to do the archaeological work to uncover the histories and the origins of these problems, and then actually engage in restoration work to help to address them collectively. Again, we're hoping that this serves as a new way to conduct archaeology in ways where we're going outside of our discipline to think about ways of offering new experiences to communities in the ways that they need it. Our underwater archaeology work extends beyond the island of St. Croix. I recently came back with some of my colleagues from St. John in the U.S. Virgin Islands to help map a historic shipwreck over there, and then working with the Smithsonian Slave Wrecks Project, helping to locate, document, and interpret slave shipwrecks all over the world. A lot of our history is actually underwater, and very little of it is actually studied. There's a lack of maritime archaeologists out there. It's a very expensive endeavor. It involves a lot of training. And the goal is really to continue to help to try to develop the capacity so we can begin to uncover more of our history that exists underwater. Again, I'm excited to be a member of the Explorers Club. I'm excited to connect with many more explorers out there and see how we can collectively create a new world that we would like to live in, and perhaps use our research experience, our personal experiences, and our life experiences to make a change in our community and the communities in which we live and work.
Hello. Thank you so much for the invitation to present in the activist panel of the Explorer Club's 50. I'm Dr. Danielle N Lee. I'm a biologist and outreach scientist, and I love to share more about my work with you. I study the natural history, behavior, and ecology of rodents across environmental gradients or landscape gradients. I specifically study the ecology, behavior, and natural history of nuisance rodents. That's because there haven't been a place, space, time, or human culture that hasn't been vexed by rodents. Rodents have been mankind's most pervasive and pernicious, uninvited commensal species. And whether we're looking at when people live in more rural areas or in the suburban areas, or even in our inner city central areas, rodents have always been a major issue. And we've learned about this both contemporarily and in ancient times through both science and in our arts. Do you remember the story of city mouse and county mouse, a country mouse? That's the story of nuisance rodents over these landscapes. I specifically studied giant pouch rats in East Africa, in Tanzania. The species I study is Chrysitomys ansorgii. It is an amazing, really large rodent. It can get up to about 2.5 feet, or up to about 70 centimeters from nose to tip of tail as an adult. And they can weigh up to about 2 kg or about 4 pounds. It's a really interesting rodent. They have these large cheek pouches akin to hamsters where they raid pantries if they're in more urbanized areas, or even the deep farmlands, robbing farmers of their precious cropland, influencing the food table. So they're pests both in rural settings and in urban settings. But an interesting thing has happened in the urban areas in Morogoro, Tanzania. These pest animals have been removed from homes, taken into captivity, bred and trained to detect landmines, as well as tuberculosis. So they've taken this pest animal and they've managed through just simple positive conditioning to train them to detect things. So they're now very important biodetectors. And I travel to Tanzania roughly every other year, studying Chrysitomys ansorgii in the wild and trying to understand more about their natural history. Because despite being able to successfully train them, we still don't know much about how they make a living. And I find it curious that an animal that has been a nuisance, we've been able to train it, but not without a lot of hiccups. And understanding what makes them pesky helps us understand what makes them just so good at making a living off of us. And ideally, what can we learn to apply in later contexts when we want to continue training some of them to help us save more lives? I also study here at home in the Midwest US, local field mice species. I study everything from voles, such as prairie voles, Microtus ophiogaster, various species of Peromyscus, sometimes called deer mice, white-footed mice, as well as the very, very familiar house mouse, Mus musculus. And every now and then, if I'm really lucky, I'll come across jumping mice. I want to understand all of these mice that live in this region. Sometimes I can find them in the same general vicinity within a mile of each other. And I've occasionally found them all in the exact same fields, but I don't always find them all together. I don't find them in the same numbers or densities or abundance. And I don't always find them at the exact same time of year or across years. And I want to understand over this region, this metropolitan region where we have everything from deep center city to more rural areas, and even some either returned natural areas or less disturbed areas. Why is it we see not only these four or five different species, but what is it about how they make a living, both off of us or adjacent to us or using our resources, or in the case of the jumping mice, why they tend to avoid us, and because they don't seem to thrive when it's too much development. I want to understand these big differences in how these different species of nuisance rodents thrive. What do they need to live? Where do they live? And why do we see these population differences over time, over space, over place, and seasons? But all of this, so, and my work also includes behavioral observations. So I sometimes bring them in the lab, or I do observations directly in the field, doing what we call these very traditional behavioral apparatus, understanding how they engage in novelty. And so the one thing about studying these wild animals is that they've never seen any of these apparatuses before. And then they all get this fresh, exposure to these strange apparatuses that can be used to help us understand how they make decisions. Do they alternate their behavior when we're given the same test over multiple trials? Do they take a long time to participate? Do they go fresh out the gate? So are some more bold, some more shy or reticent? Do they explore or investigate novel food sources, or do they avoid them? And all this information helps us understand a little bit better about their natural history and their evolution. Because if you think about it, what makes rodents so successful in vexing people and occupying the places that we live, whether it's a lot of us, such as in cities, or fewer of us, such as in the rural areas, they're successful because of their generalist habits. In other words, rodents can eat almost anything, and they can make a living almost anywhere. They just need a few key resources. And I want to understand what helps different species or even different individuals within a species just do well in the face of disturbance, in the face of unpredictable as well as predictable disturbances. And what I mean by that is, if you think of in farmlands, there is infrequent yet predictable disturbances. So in the beginning of the season, when they start planting their crops, then at the end of the season, when they harvest them, so they're not being disturbed much, but it's also on a routine. Versus in a lot of city areas, there's this unpredictability, lack of predictability of when areas are going to be disturbed. When we build new apartment buildings, that's an unpredictable disturbance. And once it's been disturbed, then it's likely to change for forever and disrupt these species, not just the rodents, but everything around it. And how they adjust and bounce back, if they bounce back. These are the things that my lab and I explore. So I run an intersectional research squad, and the tag of my lab is Science That Serves. And these are the 4 egalitarian principles of the research that I do and I train my students: engagement, behavior, ecology, and justice. So when I say engagement, I mean we seek out and we focus on community participation. There is a large component of science outreach and science communication in our research, so communicating what we do. In other words, we want to make sure that the science we do makes sense. And because we are working in these human gradients from urban areas, residential areas, and business areas, we really do need the community to participate. In other words, we need that informal permission from community leaders to be in their neighborhoods. And often we're asking to come into their properties or come into their homes to survey these nuisance rodents and to also get their feedback. In other words, what other potential issues are happening that I don't see because I am truly looking at it from an ecological point of view. And they have deeper issues that understanding these mouse infestations or these pouch rat infestations are important to them. I have been classically trained to study the behavior of animals, as I shared with you before. So we are interested in understanding behavior, behavioral biology, as well as variation or this individual differences of individuals, as well as comparing populations to one another and species to one another. Ecology, understanding the natural history of animals, so simple descriptive biology, wildlife biology. Because I do this biology and ecology in an urban context, urban ecology. And so I also tend to train students and get them engaged in understanding the role and interconnection between habitat and environment. And specifically, I study mammalogy since I study these small mammals. And then there's justice. During research, doing science in particular, especially in today's context, we understand that science isn't just simply examining your questions and answer and trying to accept or refute your hypotheses. Science is a very human endeavor, and how we do it matters. And so focusing on the social justice impact of our science, in other words, does our science matter right now? Are we making sure we're very careful about not exploiting communities or individuals in the process of doing our science? Bioethics is centered not just from a culpability point of view, but always in conversation and dialogue with ourselves and with others, especially at the community level, to make sure the science we do is fair and just and matters and is equally applied. And also recognizing that justice is not just in how we treat people that we work with, it's also how we treat people that we engage with as we do our science, as well as the environment. So respect for nature and all of humankind as we do our science. I'm excited that I engage a lot of scholars, everything from undergraduate college students, graduate students, as well as high school students and community members. And that's because our science is about matter. The tagline of the DN Lee Research Squad is, we do basic science research in service of applied research interests. Because by studying a creature that has always vexed humanity, that is responsible for spreading diseases, we recognize that understanding this ecology is deeper than just simply understanding ecology for ecology's sake. That this is baseline or foundational information that is very useful for other scholars in other fields, namely public health, those interested in community service as far as better outcomes for underserved communities, economically disenfranchised. And that's because the disproportionality of some of these negative health incomes that rodents are particularly, the culprit of spreading. So I'm thinking of things like asthma, spreading diseases such as salmonella, leptospirosis, contaminating foodstuffs, contaminating or damaging food crops. People deserve to have this information to help make their lives better in the meantime, not just later. And so even though I'm a natural history researcher, my social justice really gets into not only studying natural history, but understanding how we use that information. I'm driven to study natural history because I want to get to the bottom of the basic details of species that we assume we know. We already think we know these animals because they're so common and they're every day. And the truth is, just because they're right outside our door doesn't mean we've necessarily codified and reported this information and disseminated it for all to understand. And that's why I'm so especially proud that I have amazing hosts at Sokoine University of Agriculture in Morogoro, Tanzania. And even though I really enjoy studying pouch rats, I've learned so much. I'm contacted by many as an expert of pouch rats. The truth is, everything I know and everything I've learned has been from a very indigenous knowledge perspective. Mr. Shabani Lutea is my technician. He works for the university as a technician, but in truth, he is the world's authority on giant pouch rats. He's the one who knows where to find them. He's instructed me in everything I know about understanding their basic biology and natural history, where to find them, how to safely handle them. And he's been instrumental in understanding the few facts that we've been uncovering about where they live, how they live, and how to follow them over place, space, and time. And it is for this reason that I'm so excited about doing research in the context of places and spaces where everyday people are and working with them every day. It's a very different way of engaging science that's not just happening inside the universities or inside the institutions, but it's also recognizing that science happens all the time with all manners of audiences. And even though, yes, I'm very lucky and I get to travel around the world to study rodents, but I recognize that these really important questions are happening right outside of our front door, at our back doors, and getting everyone involved in the process, empowering everyone to ask their questions and to collaborate so that we can all help one another make this world a better place. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the Explorers Club for the honour of getting to take part in this panel discussion. It really is a tremendous honour to do so, and quite humbling. As has been mentioned, my name's Joshua Powell, and I'm a conservation biologist from the UK. I'm currently doing my PhD at ZSL's Institute of Zoology in UCL. And scientifically, I'm broadly concerned in the conservation of mammals, and I have a particular interest in large carnivores. But my interests are a little broader than that and essentially boil down to environmental and biodiversity conservation. So I was previously a policy advisor for the UK's Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and I'm currently an advisor for the Queen's Commonwealth Trust on Environment and Society. So given the theme of this evening is about activists, I actually wanted to start not by talking about my work, but some of what motivated me to do what I do. And I was very fortunate to grow up on the south coast of the UK, which for those of you who haven't visited before is this beautiful temperate woodland, not dissimilar to some areas of New England. However, it's also an area of the world that's heavily impacted by human activities, and it has a high global environmental impact. So changes made in our behavior can make a real difference. And I've very much been shaped by that. And so my activism's been around the environment, and specifically trying to inspire people, particularly young people, to take environmental and conservation action. And that's something that for me started back in school when I was 14. A particularly impactful experience was getting a letter back from the then Prime Minister after I'd written to him about how I thought the UK wasn't doing enough on climate change. This was back in 2008, 2009, and some policy suggestions of what I thought the UK should be doing. And it's really continued from there through school and university, youth county council, and into my work. And one area I just wanted to particularly talk about was WWF Voices, which is a campaign that I was one of the founding members of for WWF International. It's now expanded out, and we've got members from the UK and South Africa and India, and a range of other countries. And what the aim of the campaign is to generate digital content for WWF, but to use these new digital platforms to connect with audiences, and particularly young people all around the world, and to interest them in different parts of the globe and in environmental action and steps we can all take. And that's ranged from holding Q&A sessions about polar science from the Arctic, to creating videos for Earth Hour, which you've probably all heard of, to doing blogs and videos. And it's been really inspiring, the size and the reach that this has been able to have. And I think we're still learning about how we can use this to its full potential. But I'm really excited to see where WWF Voices goes from here. If you want to find out a bit more, I'd recommend that you go to any search browser or social media of choice and just type in the hashtag WWF Voices. It's also influenced my work as well, both in conservation science and in policy. and about wanting to make that impact and wanting to make that change. Whether that's Range Without Borders, which you might have heard of if you're at ECAD in 2019, or in my PhD. So I'm currently doing a piece of work where we're trying to encourage South Korea to join the Convention on Migratory Species, for example, or CMS. But there was one area that I particularly wanted to talk about, which was my interest in island conservation. And as you probably know, the UK is a country of islands, whether that's the British Isles themselves or the British Overseas Territories, which are 14 remote scattered territories around the world. And these British Overseas Territories are particularly important. They make up 94% of all of the known British endemic species. And other countries have played a leading role in developing island conservation approaches, New Zealand in particular. And I thought it was important that the UK learned from that and tried to follow their lead. It's since been a fairly major area of my work. And if you'd like to find out more about island conservation, we recently did a video for the British Ecological Society. You can find it on YouTube if you search Saving Britain's Islands. And it talks about invasive species removal and a suite of techniques we can use to help conserve biodiversity on these remote offshore islands. But I just wanted to give one example of how I've tried to implement into my scientific work research that will hopefully have an impact and very much with an activist outlook on the environment. And that was that earlier this year, when I was in South Korea, I was invited by Project Moonbear, which is a Korean organization led by veterinary students that's helping to improve the welfare conditions of the country's captive moon bear population, which were left over from the wildlife trade. So complicated legal status. And we were invited to visit one of the farms here. We're creating water baths so that the bears had access to drinking water. And they aim to improve the welfare conditions of the bears, build a sanctuary so that the bears can be rehomed, and campaign to end bear farming across the country. But we know that substitution is an issue for the wildlife trade. And so when I got back, I set up a new project to look at potential issues around substitution, particularly badger farming. So a switch away from farming bears to farming badgers. And a lot of experts in Korea who I'd spoken to thought that this had emerged in the early 2000s and then had fizzled or died out. But as this preliminary data shows, although the number of households involved in badger farming has declined dramatically over the past 18 years, the actual number of badgers that are farmed hasn't really. And this has implications both for welfare, but also for conservation. The status of the Asian badger is poorly known, but also potentially for zoonotic disease risk. And we're hoping to publish this work later this year, and hopefully it will help shed some new light on an area of wildlife trade which is really so far been largely overlooked. So I hope that was an interesting introduction to my work. Please do feel free to get in touch with me, anyone who's listening, if you'd like to talk more about environmental or biodiversity conservation, particularly of life on land. Thank you very much.
Well, let's dive right in. The underlying topic of today's conversation is activists. With explorers, that's an interesting idea because the whole notion of exploration includes this idea of coming back from whatever it is you've seen, whatever it is you've done, and saying or doing something that yields value, yields to the greater good. In this case, there's some very specific values that are being promoted here. And I came across something that Danielle had said as I was researching this about the need for three elements: patience, justice, and respect. And I wanted to start with you on that theme of patience, justice, and respect, especially as regards to being out in the field, dealing with other people, bringing something from elsewhere that has to integrate. What does it mean to you to embody those words?
So when we're in the field, we're often under these really, really tight time constraints and budget constraints. So when the wolf of scarcity is on your back, it really makes you feel like you have to do whatever you have to do to cut corners to get your data. And what I learned is that the timetable and expectations that I have on myself and that we historically have on ourselves and our more Western institutions doesn't align with the values of where I am. So when I work locally in Tanzania, time is a very different construct. People's pace is very, very different. And no matter how important that data is to me, I can't rush people. Like it's rude. You know, I'm literally in someone else's home. And just because it's important to me doesn't mean I have to make them behave urgently. And it really made me pause and think about whether intentional or not, there is this legacy of urgency and rushness and not being respectful of those local places that we go into to do our science research. And it made me start thinking twice about even what I extract from it, because Western science is natural history is still historically very extractive. We take things away. And I started recognizing that I wasn't there to discover anything, it was already known. I needed permission and I needed to be patient enough to learn that information. So I really started changing the way I started talking about it. Like I would start saying, instead of like unknown, we were like, no, unknown to Western science, because indigenous science, they've literally known this thousands of years. There's no way you've been living with these plants and animals for thousands of generations in that particular place and space over all that time, and you don't know it just because we don't use the same words. And what it's caused me to do is to shift how I do science, even though I'm trained as a Western scientist, and I'm striving very hard to decolonize my own thinking about my science, how I do science, natural history. And what I recognize, what I do now is I've been given the honor and privilege of codifying this information for Western science. And that's where the patience comes in. The justice is making sure that there's equal sharing of the risk and the responsibilities and the accolades of, you know, bringing this information to the forefront. And the respect is just respecting all the different levels of knowledge that exist, not just simply from other credentialed individuals that we recognize, but talking to the elders, talking to the children. Actually, they're some of my best scouts whenever I go into places. Kids are always like, follow me. And I'm like, yeah, that's why wasn't I following the kids? Of course they know where all the fun stuff is and how to get to it. And of course the elders know what's changed over several generations. And of course the folks my age know, you know, what other changes have happened. It's like listening to that has really made a difference. And it's not only enriched the science that I collect, by enriching those relationships, I now have something that a lot of scientists wish that they could have. And that's the opportunity for longevity to continue doing this work. And when COVID hit, it really changed my ability to travel. So I still can't physically get there. And yes, things are on hold, but because I have deep relationships of respect, I can pick up where I left off.
Speaking of decolonialization, I want to go to Justin and your study. I was very intrigued by this triad of slavery, commodification, and environmental degradation. And I just would like you to talk about that. And again, this notion of being in the field. I mean, again, there's a lot of diving, a lot of scuba, a lot of undersea, a lot of equipment, a lot of technology, but in places where you're bringing a bunch of equipment and technology to a place to examine something that occurred there. There are people there who are part of the history of that thing that occurred. I'm very curious about this, how you form this relationship between the commodification of slavery and the commodification of environmental degradation, and how that reads to the local people where you're doing the work.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. You know, I think it's interesting. Sometimes the work kind of picks us instead of us picking the work. And as an archaeologist, a terrestrial archaeologist, you know, I was trained to excavate sites on land. And the concept of going underwater and dealing with water was seen as a whole separate world, figuratively and literally. So when I got involved in doing archaeology in St. Croix in the Virgin Islands, we initially went out there with the idea of just excavating to try to understand what the life was like for the enslaved people in the place. After a while, you start to have conversations with community members and you start to see the environment that you're around. And you realize some of the key issues in these communities that might not necessarily deal specifically with the research that you're doing, but there is a potential for you to build collaborations and bridges. So after our first year there working in St. Croix, I was working with my colleague, Dr. Ayana Llewellyn, who's also a member of the Explorers Club. And we actually were sleeping on people's couches and they were cooking dinner for us, and conversations came up around, the excess plastic that was on land coming up on the shore. Sargassum was a big issue with this toxic seaweed that was coming up on the beaches. And then the correlation between modern production of rum and all of the runoff and everything else associated with it. So while we're excavating, an 18th century rum plantation, and then seeing the modern day effects of rum production in an island, it really caused this trigger to occur. And that's when I realized, most of our research is studying slavery from the human experience, but very rarely do we consider what the environmental ecological impacts are. And then being a scuba diver, of course, I was even more curious about what are the impacts underwater as well. So that got me actually diving first recreationally and then more scientifically to try to experiment and look at what some of these impacts are. We have coral that's being used in the early building constructions in the Virgin Islands. And some of those same coral are there underwater just off the coast. And again, if I wasn't involved in diving, I wouldn't know that those two things existed. But really, again, talking back to that idea of patience, it was something that we kind of had to develop more slowly because we already had a quote unquote set research objective and trajectory. But we saw that the community was very interested in these types of questions. And then I think, more importantly, the work that we do as explorers oftentimes is going out in the world, understanding what some of the challenges our other communities are facing, learning the ways in which they deal and grapple with those challenges, and then trying to bring those back to our own communities to see how we could help and address those. And, I'm based here now in Tavangar, which is Southern California. And, we're dealing with similar issues of environmental degradation and a whole series of ways in which pollutants have been dumped into the ocean. So trying to find ways now in which we can actually go out and engage youth in this process. Because one of the things we find in archaeology is the archaeology that was done 20 years ago likely won't be the archaeology that's done 20 years from now. And I think as we continue to come up with new questions and explore new challenges, we'll change our practice along with it. So that's kind of the mindset between the work that I've been doing and trying to bridge all those connections and linking the environment with people to show that it's a holistic system that we need to change and decolonize.
That's great. That is a nice segue over to Joshua and Rangers Without Borders. And, you're working with people who are attempting to do, wildlife conservation work, sometimes in super remote areas. And since as I was looking into some of the other stuff that's printed, border regions where even access is questionable or problematic. And you had also talked about this notion of a shift in voice, a shift towards more localized agenda in how you bring what it is you bring to be effective with these people. I think it'd be interesting to hear, because a very different kind of place. Most of what it looks like you're working with are mountainous and boreal kind of environments. I'm sure there are others. But that border, the politics of a border, complicate that in a way that I think is interesting. Anyway, I'd like to hear how you are working, especially when there's this additional political implication of being along borders.
All of that's really interesting. Thanks, Joe, and thank you for having us this evening. I guess in terms of different voices being involved in that conversation, just to answer that part of your question first, it was certainly around the work of wildlife rangers and the support that's provided for them. That tends to have quite an Africa-centric focus around the world for good reasons in terms of some of the wildlife populations that are threatened and some of the well-known threats that those populations face, and possibly the US National Park System. But what we were really interested in was that rangers work, as you say, all around the world in all of these different environments. Many of them face very different challenges. And we realized that the support that was required was therefore going to be very different. And this is something that some of the big conservation organizations are also looking to do now. WWF are running a survey looking at the work of rangers in lots of the tiger states across Asia, for example. So again, another very different part of the world. And the experiences of rangers in all these different locations is different. And that affects really the way we think about support. I mean, a great example is the question of firearms and kind of militarized training. That's something that is very often provided for rangers, particularly in an African setting. But a lot of the rangers in Central Asia that we've interviewed found that actually wasn't what would be useful. What would be useful would be biological skills training in their context. And so it was really important to try and better understand that. The second part of your question about borders is really interesting because, as I'm sure everyone listening can tell from my accent, I'm from Europe. And unlike the US, obviously, we're a patchwork of fairly small states. And that means conservation has to work across borders. It's quite a natural way of thinking if you work in conservation in Europe and in lots of other parts of the world. And there's a combination of ways that can happen. As you say, there are challenges that borders present, but there's also opportunities. And that's a big part of, certainly in conservation, looking to use international wildlife law and transboundary conservation initiatives to try and overcome that. And that's a really exciting part of work where we need to do a lot more worldwide.
You know, so often conservation agendas come up against somebody's agenda. And borders strike me as one of these in the first. I mean, I did a snow leopard conservation expedition deep in the point of the Altai in Mongolia, where there was Russia, Kazakhstan, and China within, you know, less than miles of where we were. And there's no line, and somebody could just walk up and tell you this was China and tell you you have to go away. You know, and if you were walking around with a weapon, somebody could probably justifiably just shoot you, thinking, oh, I thought it was China. I thought it was Russia. Don't you run into, I mean, it's not like in Europe, we know the borders, we know where the borders are. In a lot of these areas, there's a huge DMV, like a big empty zone that you have to sort of negotiate between. And often those areas have a lot of animals in them because they don't have a lot of people in them, but they're also poaching zones and all kinds of dark activity happens in these areas. Do you run into, you come up against this as an impediment, or do the rangers sort of get a pass because of what they're doing? As you stated, what they're doing is kind of non-militarized and, you know, able to pass between.
But it varies from country to country. So one of the great examples was in Kyrgyzstan, in one of the border zones where we were working with rangers there. Rangers were drawn from the community that lived in the border zone. So that's one very good example of where it requires drawing the rangers from the local population. Other examples, that poses a real challenge. And there are examples from Europe of that. So the border between Poland and Belarus is a great example. So a democratic member of the EU and a country which is often referred to as Europe's last dictatorship. And there is a fence line down the middle of a single forest, which divides one of Europe's most important wildlife populations. And that's a great example of that. And I'm currently doing my PhD at the moment, and I'm trying to look at some of these questions and some of these challenges specifically with the Amur tiger population in Northeast Asia. Because of course, as you say, for an individual animal, it doesn't know it's crossing a political border. If it's protected on one side of the border and it wanders across from Russia into China or North Korea in the Amur tiger's case, then it might be faced with entirely different threats in that situation. And that is a huge challenge.
So I'm going to circle back around on this whole thing about community again. And I want to come back to Danielle, because you work very often when we're working with conservation and animals, the idea of the animal as a pest is very task specific, very conditionally specific kind of category. Like a snow leopard is a pest if I'm raising goats in a mountainous region where snow leopards hunt and my goats have displaced native species, then a snow leopard is a pest. You deal with a lot of animals that are commonly held to be pests.
Yeah, poor rats and mice. And that's historic. Like, I dare you to name a time, a place, even a human culture that hasn't regarded rodents as these nuisance. And it's strange, but even though they're universally grouped as pests, we have different relationships with them in different places. So in Tanzania, I studied the African giant pouched rat, which has this very mixed reputation. So on one hand, they've been successfully trained to detect landmines, tuberculosis. So they do this amazing work, and they've become this beacon and mascot for innovation and applied science. But the exact same species where their parents are like, those animals are bred in captivity, but where their parents and grandparents were taken from, they were literally taken from the backs of people's homes or in their fields, like literally one generation removed from nuisance. But even that, I'm learning there's different relationships. So like in the more rural areas of the Shambas, pouch rats are a problem because they can store so much feed in their cheeks and take it to their underground homes. But they're not the number one offender in the rural area. So like they can live for years and years and years and just be under the surface until they're a problem. But in the more urbanized area where people live in higher densities, that's where the complaints are, where they hang out in the garbage piles, they break into the chicken coops, they are able to get inside some of their structures because depending on where they are, where people are socioeconomically, their housing structures are more secure or less secure. Like some places, they still have like pantries that are made of wood and mud, versus wealthier people have at least some brick structure. So there's this difference in relationship with the animal based in your socioeconomics and also based on where they're vexing you. So almost all the house rats I caught, even in the urbanized areas, they were all hanging out by what we would call outhouses. So it was a problem, but it wasn't in their face. It was only a problem when they started building their structures under their houses or when it caused the collapse. So even just a few meters would make a difference in the urgency of ridding them. And we see this repeated, maybe at a different scale. So here in the States, I study local field mice. And again, the average person, a mouse is a mouse is a mouse. They're not looking at the different species that live there. I'm interested to know which species are actually causing you the trouble versus the ones you think are causing you the trouble. And and it varies. It varies from your structures that are around. It varies on that season, because some years we can have a boon in one species and a different one that looks just like it. So literally, only reason I know the difference because I've been trained to know the difference. But like complete species overturn and nothing seemingly big happen. But it's still a problem. People are like, I just don't want them here, or this year is low and they're around, but they're not causing a big problem. And then lo and behold, two seasons later, they seem to just come out of nowhere and then you can't get rid of them.
And again, very often when there is a human animal conflict, the resolution is to come up with some kind of modus vivendi. I mean, snow leopards are a great example of this, where they live very often in areas with a Buddhist culture where people don't even want to shoot them, but they're like, I got to do something. Give me a plan, give something, and we'll do it. But with rodents, I imagine, I don't know this, I'm actually asking, is there any world of consciousness of like, if they stay over there, I'm good, they can be there, or is it an eradication mentality?
It is an eradication mentality. However, people will honestly acknowledge that you can't really get rid of them. And that's where the mental negotiation begins to come in. So how do we get them under control? So that's what integrated pest management is all about. It's like understanding the biological context. So some of the solutions in Tanzania for dealing with the rodent problem is how you harvest the grain and how you store it. Rodents depend on their nose. If you can store your grain in odor tight things, it is functionally invisible to the rodents. If people have access to stronger materials in their home and how they build the foundation of their homes, then all that underground tunneling doesn't vex them. So in other words, like there are some human solutions of things that can be done. So even over there may not be so far, far away, but just having better access to information, which informs, which is one of the reasons why the motto of my research group is science that serves. I do basic science in service of applied research interests, because by understanding the natural history of rodents, so this is why I do it. For an animal that has been humanity's biggest vexation, they have always managed to always win or they keep winning. So I want to know how they make a living. And by understanding their natural history, their basic biology and ecology, I can then help people come up with solutions that actually work in the long term, because eradication gets rid of them, but they breed like crazy. They're not gone. They'll be back until you figure out how to keep the door shut.
Using the knowledge that you have to bring something back to the community that is restorative, that will bring balance, that will bring balance, right? I want to go back to Justin on this for a second, because you're dealing in, as you said, a question of something that can be treated as history that is really a kind of continuity. There is clearly a continuity of injustice. There's a continuity of commodification. There's a continuity of environmental degradation. And how does your study, the work that you do, how does it roll back in restoration, redress, balance? Is there a way that this can be, this knowledge is more than just a chronicle of injustice, but actually has a way of bringing about redress, restoration, equity?
Yeah, definitely. First, I want to say to Danielle, next time I have a rodent problem, I'll call the integrative pest manager instead of the exterminator and see if we can deal with that. But you know, your research, it speaks to an important point, which is, I think for all of us, the ultimate goal is some sort of physical, tangible, meaningful outcome, as opposed to just the research itself for the sake of doing research. And I think that's something that's, you know, it's in the back of all of our minds when we do this work, but it isn't always promoted in the foreground. And I think that's partly because when we're trained in very specific disciplinary boundaries. So as an archaeologist, I'm trained to do archaeology. And if a problem that I'm confronted with requires expertise outside of that, I'm told to get somebody else, or to wait and have somebody else do it later later down the line. But all of us are humans. We're all people. We have the ability to learn just as everybody else has the ability to learn. And we have the ability to train just as everybody else has the ability to train. So I think that there's a way that we can begin to do work now where we're no longer requiring on quote unquote experts to come up with solutions, but we can actively think through and with communities to see what that would look like. For the work that I'm doing, part of it is trying to address that physical problem, but going back to the mental and the sort of social issues that created it in the first place. So when we talk about something like slavery, the actual physical act of slavery is one thing, but you have to ask yourself, what is it that allows somebody to engage with another person to enslave them? And oftentimes it's this mentality that they are not human or they are not fully human. Similarly, that same sort of commodification that happens to people is also happening to ecologies and landscapes, to the point where people were being bought and sold and commodified at the same time that landscapes on a massive international scale were also being bought and sold and commodified. Now, we had an abolition of slavery, And there's some debate over whether or not we fully abolish this idea of people being able to be bought and sold. But we've never had a similar process engage with land and landscapes. And so this idea of every piece of land should be available to be bought and sold is still a basic concept in many countries that have been affected by this transatlantic slave trade. So what we're trying to do is say, well, what does it look like to engage more in this concept of having commons? What does it look like to rethink our relationships to lands and our ability to actually own things? It's a very foreign concept in many places. So we need to revisit those. And I think part of that, getting at that solution and at that answer, it's such a foreign concept for many people. You don't really begin to fully engage it unless you're starting to engage in the work itself. And so part of the work that I'm trying to do now is pairing archaeology with ecological restoration, so that while we're spending 4 or 5 weeks excavating, we're spending 2 or 3 weeks doing conservation work, whether it's coral conservation or coral restoration or some sort of engagement, because we're realizing the physical act of contributing to something creates this positive sort of feedback loop where people are saying now, okay, I am a person in a larger ecological system. And culturally, these are the things that I'm interested in, but also ecologically and environmentally, these are also things that are interesting. And by getting different types of training, I can contribute to both of these. And part of it is, you know, some of this restorative work isn't necessarily just restoring the environment for the sake of restoring the environment, but it's restoring the environment to have a closer connection with that environment that you live and work in, so that you can begin to change your mindset and how you interact and work with it. And that's the ultimate goal. I mean, we're all still, even as researchers, we're still trying to grapple with this and get a better footing and understanding of it. But hopefully we hope it leads to a different type of science in the future.
Yeah, that notion of the rights of land itself, the parallel between the commodification of people and the commodification of land. And this notion that we've sort of begun to address one and not address the other at all, this notion of land possessing rights in and of itself, that leads me back to Joshua, because again, some of the regions where I know you work have traditions of sacred land, have traditions of land that is meant to not be interfered with. And I noticed in one of the things you had talked about, converted poachers in the, I think it was in the snow leopard context of guys who had been poachers. I came across this myself with the work that I was doing in Mongolia as well, who during the breakdown of the Soviet Union, you know, were massively harvesting wildlife. And now kind of, but at the same time had this sense of this thing I'm doing isn't right. So I'm curious how this, is it a cultural thing with these converted poachers? Is it, what is the mechanism? And do you come across this notion in the areas where you work of this premise, imagine, of land possessing a right in and of itself?
That's a really interesting set of questions. In terms of the snow leopards, where it's poacher turned gamekeeper, essentially, one of the best examples of that I personally know of. There are a few advantages that the snow leopard states had in that regard, and it's not something we see with all big cats and all big cat conservation. So big cats, as everyone will know, have a very complicated relationship with humans over a very long history. The snow leopard states in Central Asia are a little different because snow leopards occur at very low densities. They don't pose the same risk to human life. They pose a risk to livelihoods, but not to life, and that generates a different form of fear to, say, the tiger or the lion. And that allows, in, for example, the Kyrgyzstan context or elsewhere in the former Soviet states, and where there was the economic and the political chaos of the 1990s, as you say, and that drove people, unfortunately, towards poaching. Once that situation stabilizes, large conservation organizations like WWF and Panthera and WCS are able to go in and provide alternative livelihoods a livelihood as a ranger rather than as poacher. And the vast majority of individuals who we spoke to in Kyrgyzstan, for example, who were rangers, were much happier doing that, and that was really encouraging. But it's not something you see all around the world with all big cats, unfortunately, and that's a really big challenge. In terms of the idea of public land or commons land, as we've picked up, that sacred land is just one expression of that. And I think it's important to remember that for a large amount of the world, this was a very common phenomena historically. So just talking about where I live, the UK, that was something that we had for thousands of years. And that only began to change really in the past 300 years. So within the context that it had been operating, that's a fairly short time period. And it's very important, I think, to remember that a lot of different countries around the world have this concept. It might just be expressed in different ways, or it might be understood practically in different ways. It's a very common phenomena.
Okay, another thing we do is ask each person to describe, it used to be a typical day, but a typical day might not be a great day. So what we want you to do is describe a great quintessential day, not the best day you ever had, but like a quintessentially great day. And I'm going to start with Danielle.
Oh, a quintessential great day. In Tanzania, it would involve me waking up really, really early in the morning, right before dawn, getting dressed, getting in the truck and headed out to the field and checking traps. And exactly no more than 25% of my traps are tripped. Because if more than that, I would love to have all the animals, but more than that, I couldn't process them. So no more than 25, anywhere from 10 to 25% of my traps have target animals in them. And my team and I are able to process them and get lots of good data, be able to tag many, many individuals and release at least half of them back so that we can follow them back and track their movements. A quintessential good day is really, it'll all end by noon if I'm lucky, because we get so much done that morning. So tracking the animals, dusting them so that we can go back later. We can take a break in the middle of the day because field researchers don't work when it's hot outside. We all go rest, have a nice lunch, and come back out around an hour before dusk and set the traps again, and then go follow those tracks to find those animals. And we find all of them. We know exactly where they are. And then that evening is spent having a really great meal together. That's a quintessential great day in the field.
Yeah, I think I have to compete against the Indiana Jones stereotype that's in many people's heads. So I tell people I don't have pistols or whips involved in my archaeological excavations, but I've been doing a lot more maritime archaeology recently. And so a great day for me usually involves waking up early in the morning. We do Airbnbs now, so it's almost like a real world situation with all the researchers in one house. And we have an early breakfast and get out to the dock with all of our scuba gear and our sonar equipment. And we're usually on that boat by about 9 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes we're running a magnetometer survey. So we're on the boat while the captain is steering the boat, getting the sonar data. Other days, we're actually in the water by 10 o'clock, 9:30. And diving on wreck sites. And we go underwater with our plastic slates, our #2 lead pencils, and our Mylar paper. And we are recording aspects of a shipwreck. We're taking measurements underwater. Sometimes we're recording the marine life that's in and around it. Because of the way scuba diving works, we normally only get about 2 to 3 dives in a day, which means that we usually have a lunch break. We have one more dive, and then we're good for the rest of the day. On those longer voyages, it can get a little rocky on the boat. So we often encourage that nausea medication. Otherwise, you're going to be feeding the fish instead of you eating the fish. And then we're back on the shore processing the data into the nighttime. And that's a beautiful day. I mean, we have to be on the water in the sun. So it's always a beautiful day when we're doing underwater archaeology, most of the time.
We've been trying to build up the Explorers Club partially by expanding the notion of exploration itself, expanding the idea so that it can bring in new people, so that it can reinvigorate and change and alter the club itself, what it means to be an explorer, what it means to be the Explorers Club. So I'm curious from each of you, relative to your work and relative to the destiny of the Explorers Club, about the Explorers 50 program and what hopes or ambitions you might have for the impact of this on your work, on the club, and on the perception of exploration itself. And I'll start with Justin.
Yeah, I think, for me, one of the interesting things that excites me right now is engagement with artists. And I think oftentimes we don't think of artists as explorers, but when you get deeper into the work that they do and oftentimes how they come to the work that they engage with, there's exploration involved. A friend of mine is an artist, and he's currently modifying a kayak so that he can go out to areas of the ocean that he can't normally get to, so that it can inform the type of artwork that he needs to engage with underwater. And there's just this whole cascading sort of concept, as you mentioned, where it's, one informs the other and then leads to new insights, which informs more. And for me, it's the artists that I've actually been thinking with and thinking through more abstract concepts of, what does it mean to engage in a world completely underwater? And what does it look like to build monuments or memorials underwater? How do we allow people who don't know how to scuba dive or snorkel to engage those sites? What does VR, AR look like? Is there a sort of virtual exploration that occurs in these places as well? So really, I'm hoping to be able to, the Explorers Club can sort of open that up as a whole new world then of exploration, to get at that idea of an experiential exploration that doesn't necessarily mean that you're physically going to a new part of the world or a new part of the galaxy, but exploring it from where you are.
So much of the work I do, whether it's in Tanzania or even here in the States, it's really all backyard biology. I study stuff that lives in people's backyards. And what I hope to do as far as the impact on the Explorers Club and who sees themselves as an explorer is that exploration is any amount of discovery and question asking. Yes, as a child, I dreamed of going to faraway places like the continent to do research. And I got lucky and I got to do that. But I really started my scientific exploration just having that same level of curiosity in my backyard, in my neighborhood parks. And what I hope to do, no matter where I am, is empower everyday folk to literally go outside in their backyard. So I would love for them to be fully engaged in science, codifying it, disseminating it. And what I think that means for the club itself is expand who participates and then their area of where they apply that lens. So that everyday folk can see that we still have real, authentic, everyday, unresolved natural history questions right outside of our front and back doors. That's who I hope to inspire and to attract to the club.
I hope that the EC50, and I think this will happen, will over the years support some amazing developments that I've seen just over the past couple of years with the Explorers Club. So I first got to know about the club through the Adventure Canada and the Explorers Club Young Explorers program, which I was involved in back when I was studying in the US in 2016. And there's been some amazing work that's been done at the club, led by individuals like Milbury Polk and NGen as a group, as I say, done this amazing work about expanding the club's membership to so many more young people. And that's really inspiring because that's the future of exploration. And the EC50 can play an amazing role in supporting that. And I think it has this year, and I think it will continue to do so in future years.
Well, I would, on behalf of the EC50 and the Explorers Club, like to thank you all for taking the time and for the work that you do and for the brilliant conversation that we've had, and wish you all the best of luck in the future, and hope to see you for real in the flesh someday, somewhere at an Explorers Club event. So thank you very, very much.